Especially on the ride back, Daniel was unusually quiet. He had turned 19 now, but he hadn't been camping since that day. Honestly, it took me several years before I felt at ease in the wilderness again. What was once a peaceful retreat now felt full of unseen threats hiding in the darkness. Who could say what, or who might end up near my tent next time? This experience left a lasting mark on me. I no longer feel safe hiking alone. Just remembering how close I had come to an unknown danger still sends chills down my spine. At the time, I was in a relationship with a guy named Kevin. We'd been together for about half a year and loved going on outdoor adventures. Hiking, kayaking, and that sort of thing. One Saturday, we decided to explore a new nature reserve about 45 minutes from town. We had a slow start that morning and didn't reach the park until nearly noon. The day was beautiful, and after stopping by the small visitor center to grab a trail guide, the park ranger suggested a 6-mile loop that led up to a waterfall overlook. Kevin and I laced up our boots, filled our hydration packs, and set off. At first, the trail was wide and well-marked. We chatted and admired the scenery as the path gradually climbed. After about 45 minutes, we came to a fork that wasn't on the map. We hesitated, debating which way to go. Kevin suggested taking the left path since we could faintly hear rushing water from that direction. Assuming it led to the waterfall, we went that way. As we walked, the path became narrower and less maintained. Thick undergrowth crept closer on either side, cutting off our view of the surroundings. After another 20 minutes, I started feeling uneasy, suspecting we had gone the wrong way. When I voiced my concern, Kevin waved it off. "It's just a little farther," he reassured me. "And if it's not the waterfall, maybe it's something even better." Then suddenly the trees around us grew dense and visibility shrank. We kept moving forward, but when I stepped into a small clearing, I realized Kevin was no longer beside me. I called out for him. Silence. How had that happened? He had been right next to me just moments ago. My chest tightened as I retraced my steps, scanning the trees for any sign of him. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just an empty forest stretching in all directions. I called his name again. No response. Ahead, the trail split once more. Neither path looked familiar. I had no idea which way to go. The panic started creeping in. I randomly chose one direction, thinking I just needed to get back to the main trail. But after several minutes of walking, nothing looked right. Then it hit me. I was lost, completely alone in the woods. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows through the trees. My heart pounded as I tried to find a marker, an intersection, anything recognizable. The woods had become eerily quiet, save for my own hurried footsteps. Then I heard something, a faint crunch of leaves behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I whipped around, scanning the trees. Nothing. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was something following me? Tired, out of water, and overwhelmed. I sank onto a fallen log, putting my head in my hands. Just where the hell was I? My throat was dry, my legs ached, and the weight of fear was pressing down on me. A sudden snap of a twig nearby made me jerk upright. My breath caught in my throat as I peered into the trees. That's when I saw him. A tall figure stood about 100 feet away, motionless between the trees. "Kevin," I called hesitantly, but even as the name left my lips, I knew it wasn't him. The figure was too tall, the shape all wrong. And why wouldn't he answer? A wave of terror washed over me. Gripping the biggest branch I could find, I forced my voice steady and shouted, "Stay away from me." The figure didn't move. He just stood there, barely distinguishable from the shadows, watching. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. My heart pounding, I turned and bolted, crashing through the undergrowth as fast as my legs would carry me. Every few seconds, I glanced back, but he was gone. I kept running until my lungs burned. Eventually, I stumbled into another small clearing and collapsed, trembling. My mind raced. Should I keep moving? Try to find my way back? Or would I have to spend the night out here? Then I heard it again. Faint, distant hum. Traffic. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it gave me hope. If I could just follow the sound, maybe I could find a road, a way out. With renewed determination, I pushed forward, ignoring the snapping twigs and rustling leaves around me. Was that man still out there? Was he following me? What did he want? I refused to stop. The deeper into the woods I went, the louder the distant road noise became. Relief flooded me. I was close. Just as I picked up my pace, a figure suddenly stepped out from behind a tree, directly in my path, barely 30 feet ahead. I screamed. It was him, the same man. He had somehow gotten ahead of me. As he moved closer, I finally saw his face in the dimming light, and I wished I hadn't. His skin was twisted and scarred, as though it had been burned. Patches of hair clung to his scalp, hanging in greasy strands. One of his eyes was clouded over, but the other locked onto me with unsettling intensity. A slow, crooked grin spread across his deformed face. Then, in a rough, gravelly voice, he spoke. "Why the rush? Stay a while." A cold terror unlike anything I'd ever felt shot through me. He stepped forward. I swung my branch at him with everything I had. He dodged sideways, then lunged at me. I turned and sprinted, forcing my legs to move despite the exhaustion. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the brush, his guttural yells growing closer. He was gaining on me. Then suddenly, I burst through the trees into a clearing, parking lot, a road, cars, people. Tears welled in my eyes as I ran straight toward a family loading up their car. They looked startled as I practically collapsed in front of them, gasping for air, trying to explain what had happened. The father and son scanned the tree line while the mother ushered me into their vehicle, locking the doors. The son called the police while the parents tried to calm me down. I was shaking uncontrollably, my words coming out in frantic gasps. When the officers arrived, they searched the woods but found no trace of the man. They drove me to the station, where I learned I had somehow wandered nearly 8 miles from the original trailhead. A call went out to park rangers who later found Kevin back at the main lot. He had been just as lost, wandering aimlessly after we were separated. When I told him about the man I had seen, he reassured me that I was safe now. But that face, that grotesque, twisted grin, still haunts my dreams to this day. I don't know if he was some unhinged predator or a horrifying trick of my panicked mind. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back into those woods alone again. I was 18 years old when this happened. The night was illuminated by a bright full moon, casting an eerie glow over the dense forest as I hiked with my friends, Jake and Ryan. At first, it was a crisp autumn evening, the kind that makes you feel alive. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods took on a different feel, one that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Sensing my friends were getting uneasy, I tried to shake off my own nerves. "Come on, guys, don't be scared. It's just a little darkness and maybe a few howling animals. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake, the most daring of us, had been the one to talk us into this nighttime adventure, claiming it would be unforgettable. Now, with shadows stretching longer and the forest closing in around us, even I was starting to regret the decision. Anna, who had been unusually quiet since we entered the woods, finally spoke up. "Ben, I really don't think we should be out here. It's way too quiet. I've heard stories about strange things happening in these woods on full moon nights. I had heard those rumors, too. Disappearances of pets, shadowy figures spotted between the trees, and eerie sounds with no known source. I always thought they were just myths, but as we pressed on, an unsettling chill ran down my spine. "Relax," Ryan said, slinging an arm around Anna's shoulder. "It's all in your head. Besides, Ben's got us covered, right?" I forced a grin, trying to push down my own unease. "Yeah, don't worry, Anna. Nothing's going to happen." We continued through the woods, the only sounds being our boots crunching against fallen leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The moonlight filtering through the trees cast unsettling shapes on the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. After a while, we stumbled upon an overgrown path, one we had never seen before. Thick bushes and fallen branches concealed it, as if nature itself was trying to keep people out. Jake's face lit up with excitement. "Hey, check this out. This could be a shortcut back to the car. Let's take it." Anna and I exchanged hesitant glances, but we followed as Jake eagerly hacked away at the underbrush with his pocket knife. As we cleared a path, the unease in my gut deepened. It felt like we were walking into something we shouldn't. The farther we went, the denser the forest became. The sky disappeared behind thick branches, and the air grew colder, carrying a strange, musky scent. "Are you sure about this?" Anna asked, her voice unsteady. Jake hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "We've come this far. Might as well see where it goes." Reluctantly, we pressed on, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to swallow us whole. Then I noticed something: deep, jagged gouges carved into the tree trunks. "Guys, look at this," I said, running my fingers over the fresh marks. "Probably just a bear," Jake said, but his voice lacked confidence. "Do bears even live around here?" Anna asked, barely above a whisper. "I think so," I muttered, though I wasn't sure myself. We continued, the claw marks becoming more frequent. That creeping sensation of being watched only grew stronger. Turning back seemed like the best option, but by then, I wasn't sure which way was out. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a small clearing. In its center stood an old, rotting cabin. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, as if abandoned for decades. "Why would anyone build a cabin way out here?" Anna whispered, clutching her arms. I had no answer. The entire scene felt unreal, like something from a nightmare. Jake, always the thrill seeker, grinned. "Come on, let's check it out. Maybe we'll find something cool." Against my better judgment, we followed. The door creaked open painfully, the sound cutting through the silence. Inside, the place was coated in dust and cobwebs, moonlight streaming through the broken windows. Then I saw them, scratch marks on the walls, long and erratic. "Guys, look at this," I said, my voice barely steady. Jake examined them closely. "These aren't from animals. They look human." A chill ran through me. Someone had been here, recently, and they had left in a hurry. "We need to leave. Now." As we turned for the door, a deep growl rumbled outside. Our blood ran cold. "What was that?" Anna whispered, her face pale. "I don't know," I murmured, barely able to breathe. Jake moved to the doorway and peeked outside. "I don't see anything, but we need to go." The three of us stepped out cautiously. As we backed away from the cabin, the growling intensified. A terrible realization settled over me. We weren't alone. Then, without warning, something burst from the underbrush. A hulking creature, covered in tangled fur, its eyes glowing with something almost unnatural. A werewolf. That was the only thing my brain could process. "Run!" Jake screamed. We bolted down the trail, the creature charging after us. Its heavy footfalls and ragged breaths pounded in my ears. My chest ached. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. The forest blurred as we ran, its howls growing louder. I dared a glance back. It was close, too close. The beast's snout curled in a snarl, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It was locked onto me. If it caught up, I knew I'd be first. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing my legs to move faster. Then, suddenly, we broke free from the hidden path, stumbling onto the main trail. The creature skidded to a stop at the trail's entrance, howling furiously but not following. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Gasping for breath, we looked at each other, and against all logic, our fear turned into nervous laughter. We were alive, but we had seen something we were never meant to. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing yellow eyes. I had dismissed the legends before, but now I know the truth. We never spoke of that night again. No one would believe us anyway, but I needed to tell someone, at least anonymously. Even now, I still wonder about that thing. Why did it chase us? Why did it stop? The answer to what I saw that evening remains a mystery. It moved so effortlessly through the trees that even now, whenever I enter the forest, I find myself glancing up. I have yet to identify any known animal or creature that matches its description, and after years of on and off research, I'm still left without answers. This may not be the most terrifying story, but it's definitely one of the strangest experiences of my life. It happened in the Blue Ridge Mountains during the summer of 2021. I had just finished college and wanted to do something memorable before starting my new job, something adventurous. So, I planned a solo backpacking trip for a week. Having spent my childhood exploring the Adirondacks, I was an experienced hiker and camper, so being alone in the wilderness didn't worry me. The first few days were amazing. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot. I hiked around 10 miles a day, taking in the breathtaking scenery. Occasionally, I passed other hikers, but for the most part, I was alone. On the third day, though, things started to feel off. I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, rustling leaves, had gone eerily silent. The few people I did see looked uneasy, barely acknowledging me. They moved quickly as if they couldn't wait to leave. I figured it was just the solitude getting to me, but something about their behavior left me uneasy. That night, I camped near a small river, lighting a fire more for comfort than warmth. It was a hot night, so I left my tent unzipped to let in the cool air. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I thought I heard footsteps crunching outside my tent. I held my breath and listened, but after a few moments, I heard nothing but the usual nighttime noises. Still, it took me a while to fall asleep. The next day, I packed up and continued my journey. The climb out of the valley was steep, the path rocky, and the trees grew dense. I had the unsettling sensation of being watched, though no one was in sight. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves from too much time alone. That evening, I camped in a clearing on a ridge, where I could see the distant peaks stretching around me. After making dinner and cleaning up, I crawled into my tent, exhausted. The moon was full, casting strange, shifting shadows on the fabric. Played tricks on my tired mind, but eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to my tent shaking violently. The poles bent inward, nearly collapsing on top of me. My first thought was a bear attack, and I scrambled to get out, heart pounding. But when I emerged, there was nothing there. The night was still, bathed in silver moonlight. My tent's poles were twisted and warped, but the fabric itself was untouched. I couldn't understand it. Rattled and confused, I did my best to fix the damage and forced myself to lie back down. By morning, the warm weather had shifted, replaced by a sharp chill in the air. Dark clouds gathered as I hiked down into the valley, thunder rumbling overhead. I picked up my pace, hoping to reach a nearby shelter before the storm broke. Just as I spotted it, the sky opened up, rain hammering down. I sprinted the last stretch, relieved to find it empty. My relief was short-lived. As I stepped inside, I noticed the walls were covered in smeared handprints and deep scratch marks. The floor was strewn with tattered rags, and the fire pit reeked of burned hair and something else. Something rotten. My stomach turned as I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. Then I saw it. A hulking figure moved between the trunks, its outline shifting in the storm. My instincts screamed at me to run. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush, rain slapping my face. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, something massive chasing me down. As I reached a clearing, a bolt of lightning struck the ground just behind me. The explosion of sound and light froze me in place. When I turned around, the forest was still. The wind had stopped. The only sound was the dripping of rain from the leaves. Whatever had been following me had vanished. Drenched and shaking, I found a small cave tucked between the rocks and squeezed inside, curling up in the farthest corner. I stayed there, trembling, as the storm raged outside. When the rain finally slowed, I forced myself to move, knowing I had to find a safe place before nightfall. As I made my way down the trail, every shifting shadow and rustling leaf set me on edge. Then, I felt it again, that horrible, undeniable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled as my pace quickened. The sun dipped below the ridge, stretching long shadows across my path. Rounding a bend, I collided with something solid but eerily soft. Stumbling back, I looked up and saw a pale, grotesque face staring down at me. Its eyes were nothing but black voids. Its mouth stretched open, revealing rotting, jagged teeth. I tried to run, but its clawed hands gripped my shoulders, nails piercing my skin. A foul, decayed breath washed over me as it leaned closer. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, as if it meant to swallow me whole. My vision blurred. Everything went black. I must have fainted because when I woke up, I was alone. The forest was silent. My body ached as I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my gear, and ran. Behind me, twigs snapped, sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I ran faster, tearing through the undergrowth, ignoring the branches that scraped at my arms. Just get to the car. Just get out. Finally, the parking lot came into view. Half stumbling, half sliding, I made it to my car, threw everything inside, locked the doors, and sped down the mountain road. Even with the windows up, I could still hear a distant, inhuman scream echoing from the trees. What exactly was out there? I have no idea, and I never planned to go back to find out. The memory still lingers, especially when I'm home alone for long stretches. Whatever eerie force I encountered that night, I can't shake the feeling that it's still lurking somewhere in those woods, waiting. I haven't dared to step past my backyard since. Some nights, I still hear those bone-chilling cries echoing through the trees, and all I can do is hope it never finds me again. #, the camping trip. Camping used to be one of my favorite traditions. Getting away from the city, cooking over an open fire, sharing ghost stories under the stars. What's not to love? My wife, Lisa, and I took our son, Evan, on as many camping trips as we could while he was growing up. But after what happened that weekend at Blackwood National Park when Evan was 12, I doubt I'll ever feel the same way about it again. It was late September, perfect weather before the deep chill of autumn set in. We drove up to one of our favorite campgrounds, nestled deep in the forest, on a Friday afternoon. Our campsite was in a secluded section, surrounded by towering pine trees. After setting up the tent and getting a fire started, we grilled hot dogs for dinner. Evan was thrilled when the sun went down, so I told him a few spooky tales about the creatures that supposedly roamed the woods. He was at that age where scary stories were fun rather than truly terrifying. By the time we crawled into our tent for the night, we were all worn out from the long drive and setting up camp. The first night outdoors is always the most peaceful. So still and quiet, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets inside the tent. I slept like a rock. The next morning, we made pancakes over the fire. As we ate, a park ranger stopped by to welcome us. He was an older man with a wiry build and a thick mustache. After some friendly chatter, he reminded us to secure our food properly at night, since there had been reports of bears in the area. We assured him we always used a sturdy, animal-proof container. After the ranger left, we spent the day hiking. Lisa loved bird watching and brought along her binoculars and a guidebook to identify different species. We spotted kingfishers, robins, and finches. Evan grumbled a little about being bored, but I could tell he was having fun in his own way. Later that afternoon, we played card games and relaxed at the campsite, flipping through magazines as the sun set. That's when I first noticed him, the man camping across the road from us. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the evening wore on, I caught him glancing over at us more and more. He looked rough, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with a scruffy beard and worn-out clothes. He sat by his fire, drinking beer and absently stirring the embers with a stick. Something about him unsettled me. The way he kept watching us sent an uneasy chill down my spine. Once darkness fully settled, I made sure Evan went inside the tent where he'd be out of sight. Lisa and I stayed up for a while, talking by the fire and gazing at the stars. We finally turned in around midnight. Sometime later, I woke up abruptly to the sound of twigs snapping outside the tent, leaves rustling. My body tensed as I strained to listen. Next to me, Lisa and Evan slept soundly. Then, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate crunching in the dirt, circling the tent. My heart pounded. Was it a wild animal? A dangerous stranger? Moving carefully so as not to make noise, I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on and swept the beam around the inside of the tent. Empty. The footsteps outside continued, shuffling around the thin fabric walls. My throat tightened. Taking a deep breath, I quietly unzipped the tent flap and poked my head out. I expected to see a raccoon or even a bear, but instead, my flashlight beam landed on the man from the other campsite, crouched just a few feet away with his back turned to me. The moment my light hit him, he spun around. For a second, we locked eyes. His face twisted into something wild, his eyes glassy. Then, without warning, he lunged toward me. I yelped and scrambled backward into the tent, shouting for Lisa and Evan to wake up. The man clawed at the entrance, trying to force his way inside. Lisa reacted instantly, grabbing Evan and shoving past me out of the tent. I kicked out at the man as hard as I could, my foot connecting with his face. He grunted in pain, and I seized the chance to rip open the other side of the tent and escape. Lisa and Evan were already sprinting toward the main campground. I grabbed my car keys and a pocket knife, slashing at the tent's fabric as I bolted outside. The man emerged from the collapsed tent, his mouth bleeding, his expression twisted with rage. He lunged again, but I managed to dodge him and take off after my family. We screamed for help, and within moments, other campers emerged from their tents. I shouted that a man had attacked us and pointed toward where he had disappeared into the woods. The camp hosts immediately called for emergency services. A group of campers searched the area but found no trace of him. Paramedics and police arrived soon after. We gave our statements, still shaken. There was no way we were staying another night. We packed what little we could and drove straight to a nearby motel. Even there, I barely slept. The sense of security I had always felt while camping was shattered. The next morning, exhausted, we left for home. Lisa and I hardly spoke on the drive back. Evan didn't say much either. He had always loved the outdoors, but I could see the fear in his eyes. And deep down, I knew he wasn't the only one. This particular event happened when I was in my teens, over 15 years ago. I grew up in the Pine Ridge region, spending most of my youth camping and exploring the outdoors. For 2 summers, I was part of a group that traveled through remote areas picking up litter. Most of the time, it was just roadside cleanup, but occasionally, park rangers would ask us to clear trails or back roads where people had dumped trash. On this particular day, our team was split into smaller groups to cover different zones. We had GPS devices, but back then they weren't very precise. If you were lucky, they got within 100 yards of accuracy. That didn't bother me, though. I'd always dreamed of becoming a trail guide or forest ranger. Some of the others weren't as comfortable, so they stuck closer to the roads, which meant I got dropped off at the end of a service trail and had to work my way back to our meeting point. Each of us carried garbage bags and a pick stick for collecting trash. The spot I was assigned to was known for being a major illegal dump site. Old couches, chairs, even mattresses were often left there. Luckily, a truck had already cleared the bigger items, so only smaller debris like bottles, cans, and scattered papers remained. But sometimes, we'd find darker things. Unwanted pets left in a cruel manner. That day, I stumbled upon a litter of puppies. I didn't have a radio with me, but even if I did, calling it in wouldn't have helped right away. The supervisors tried to shield us from seeing things like this, but unfortunately, it wasn't the first time I had come across something so awful. Instead of leaving them among the trash, I decided to bury them properly. I set my bag and pick stick down near the trail and walked into the forest with the small bodies wrapped in another bag. About 20 minutes from the road, I found a large pine tree that seemed like a good place for them to rest. I gently placed the bag at the base of the tree and began searching for something to dig with. I broke a thick branch in half and used my pocket knife to sharpen one end, then started digging. The soil was tough, filled with roots, making it slow work. But after I managed to dig a hole about 1.5 feet deep, I laid the poor creatures inside, removing them from the bag so I wouldn't be adding to the waste in the forest. I took a moment, even shed a few tears, and whispered a quiet prayer. Witnessing any kind of cruelty is never easy. As I was covering the hole, I heard a small branch snap about 50 feet to my left. Because of the low-hanging branches of the tree I was under, I couldn't see where the sound had come from. I froze, listening carefully. The forest wasn't completely silent. Birds were still chirping, but they seemed to be farther away than before. I stayed still for a few minutes, scanning the area. When I didn't see anything, I continued my task. Once the grave was covered, I placed a few pine cones and a smooth rock on top as a marker, then stood up to leave. That's when I heard a sound, something between a growl and a moan. This was bear country, though cougars were known to roam here too. My first thought was that a predator had caught the scent and come to investigate. All I had for defense was my pocket knife, but I wasn't panicked yet. I assumed it was just the wind causing two trees to rub together. That's a common noise in the forest. But then, another piece of bark fell from a nearby tree, about 30 yards from where I had just been. I looked up. This tree was smaller than the large pine I had buried the puppies under. Midway up, I saw something, but I had no words for what it was. It had a mottled brownish gray-green coloring and no distinct shape. It was roughly the size of a young bear cub. I instinctively jumped back, cursing under my breath. As I took several steps away, keeping my eyes locked on whatever it was, it began to move. That's when I realized it wasn't just part of the tree. Even now, I can't fully describe what I saw. It didn't have fur like a bear or a cougar, but it wasn't smooth-skinned either. It looked almost like living moss. And as far as I know, there are no sloths in this region. Whatever it wasn't any animal I had ever seen before. It turned to look at me. It had a face, but it was oddly flattened. I couldn't make out clear features, just dark patches where its eyes should be. I was about 80 feet away, and the lighting wasn't great under the tree canopy, but I could tell it had 4 limbs gripping the tree. Its paws were somewhat like a raccoon's, except the claws were as long as fingers. A long, thin tail about the length of its body twitched slightly. It moved downward slowly, never breaking eye contact with me. As it descended to a lower branch, I noticed it had round, soft ears, almost human-like rather than animalistic. Aside from the occasional scrape of claws against bark, it made no sound. Then it let out a low-pitched whistle. That was enough for me. I glanced behind me to make sure my path was clear, then turned and ran. I checked over my shoulder multiple times, but it didn't follow me. I never saw it again. Later, I told the lead ranger what I had seen. He dismissed it, saying it was probably a sick raccoon. When I insisted that the face was nothing like a raccoon's, he said I must have been mistaken. The closest thing I could compare it to was a snub-nosed monkey, but the shape, the size, and the proportions were all wrong. Besides, there are no wild monkeys in this region. It wasn't an escaped pet either. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered in the woods that afternoon. The hike to my grandparents' house from my childhood home in rural Oregon was something I knew well. Growing up surrounded by nature, I spent countless hours exploring the forests and rocky trails that stretched across our land. By the time I was 12, I knew every hidden path, every fallen log, every stream that cut through the trees. That familiarity gave me a sense of confidence, too much confidence. Looking back, I see now how reckless I was. I thought nothing in those woods could harm me. I was wrong. It began the summer before 7th grade. With school out and my parents at work all day, I had more free time than I knew what to do with. Bored of staying inside, I decided to start walking to my grandparents' place in the afternoons. Their house was just under 2 miles away, through the thick woods. The first few times I made the trek, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Their backyard bordered the forest, so I would step out of the trees and onto their lawn. My grandmother would always greet me warmly, hurrying to fix me a snack while I watched whatever was on TV. It became a simple, comforting routine. For the first couple of weeks, the walk there and back was peaceful, just me and the trees. Then, in late June, things started to feel different. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of small animals faded. The forest seemed darker, heavier. I told myself it was just the sky clouding over. I should have turned back right then. I was halfway to my grandparents' house when the first drops of rain hit my arms. I pulled up my hood and pressed on. But within moments, a deep rumble of thunder rolled through the trees, much closer than I'd expected. The wind picked up sharply, tossing branches overhead. Though it was still early afternoon, the sky had shifted to a sickly green-gray. I sped up, hoping to beat the storm, but then the rain came down in thick, blinding sheets. The dirt path quickly turned to slippery mud. My clothes were drenched, and a chill ran through me, but I kept moving toward the house up ahead. Then, out of nowhere, a shriek cut through the storm. It wasn't the cry of any animal I had ever heard. My body froze as I strained to see through the rain, scanning the spaces between the trees. A small, flickering light appeared in the distance, swaying unsteadily, as if carried by someone moving through the woods. My heart leapt. Had my grandfather come looking for me? I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the roaring wind and rain. The light kept coming, too low to belong to my tall grandfather. My stomach twisted. Then, another wail, closer this time. The light bobbed toward me between the trees. I stumbled backward, unsure of what I was seeing. My heart pounded in my ears. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that thing. The unnatural screeching chased me as I crashed through the undergrowth, slipping in the mud, branches clawing at my soaked clothes. A bright flash split the sky as lightning struck a tree nearby. The deafening crack rattled my skull, and the sharp smell of burning wood filled the air. Rain sizzled against the smoldering bark. Still, I ran. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Then another strike, this time right behind me. The blast sent me stumbling forward. I barely caught myself before hitting the ground. My entire body screamed for rest, but I forced myself onward. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, I burst into a clearing. A crumbling old shack stood at the far end, its wooden walls weathered and sagging. Without hesitation, I bolted toward it, throwing myself against the warped door just as the unearthly wail sounded again from the trees. My hands fumbled, yanking the door shut behind me. Darkness swallowed me. Shaking, I pressed my back against the wall, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. My ears rang, my heart slammed against my ribs. Outside, the thing howled, an agonizing, furious sound that made my skin crawl. I must have passed out from exhaustion, because the next thing I remember was waking in complete silence. The storm had faded to a light drizzle. The woods stood eerily still. Whatever had been out there was gone. Dizzy and disoriented, I stumbled out of the shack. A few breaks in the clouds allowed pale moonlight to filter through, just enough for me to navigate the tangled undergrowth. Arms outstretched, I walked all night, terrified that the thing still lurked just beyond my vision, waiting. By some miracle, I finally emerged from the woods as the first light of dawn broke across the sky. My house was just ahead. Stumbling up the steps, I flung the door open, slammed it shut, and collapsed onto the floor, overcome with relief. I never told my parents what happened that night. This took place a few years back on a warm late summer evening. I was 17 years old, riding my 150 cubic centimeters motorcycle through the countryside. I had gone out to clear my mind, as I was dealing with some personal struggles, and the hum of the engine always helped me relax. Most of my ride was uneventful, exactly the peace I was looking for. I was heading down a dead-end road that led to a few ponds so I could turn around and make my way home. About halfway down, I noticed someone dressed entirely in white walking along the road. Normally, this wouldn't seem too unusual, as it was a common walking path. However, seeing someone walking there at nearly midnight with no flashlight or reflective gear was odd. The road stretched for about 2 miles with no houses around, so I had no idea where this person could have come from. Out of instinct, I slowed down a bit, knowing pedestrians could be unpredictable. That was my mistake. Just as I was passing by, the person let out the most gut-wrenching, inhuman scream I had ever heard. My heart started pounding, and before I could process what was happening, they lunged straight at me. Panicked, I frantically downshifted and twisted the throttle as far as it would go. In my side mirror, I saw them sprinting toward me, their speed unnaturally fast. Now, for those unfamiliar with small motorcycles, a 150 cubic centimeters isn't exactly a powerhouse. Mine, in particular, had a modified sprocket to conserve fuel, making its acceleration even weaker. Even with the throttle fully open, the person was closing the distance. Just as I reached 30 miles per hour, I felt something, a hand slamming against the back of my bike. Terrified, I pushed my engine to the limit, letting it rev way past its safe range because I refused to shift gears while they were within reach. The figure managed to keep up with me until I hit around 40 miles per hour, at which point I finally began to lose them. But I didn't slow down. Only once I was sure they were completely out of sight did I remember that this road led straight into the woods. That realization sent a fresh wave of fear through me. As I neared the dead end, I recalled a narrow dirt trail meant for hikers. My bike was an older model with a manual light switch, so unlike modern ones where the headlight stays on, I was able to turn mine off. Instinct took over. I switched off the light, shifted into high gear to stay quiet, and veered onto the dirt path, hoping to circle back to the main road undetected. I rode as fast as I dared, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Even after I made it onto the paved road, I kept my speed high, unwilling to take any chances. When I finally reached home, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I hurriedly parked my bike in the garage, scanning my surroundings the entire time. Then, I sprinted inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. The next day, I called my friend and told him what had happened. I needed someone to go back there with me to check for any signs that this had been some kind of sick prank. We hiked through the forest alongside the road, searching for footprints or evidence of another person being there. But we found nothing. The only tracks in the dirt were ours. I'm not someone who gets scared easily. I'm 6 feet 1 inch with an athletic build, but that scream, it was unlike anything I've ever heard. Just thinking about it now sends chills down my spine. I've shared this story with a few close friends, and they believed me because I'm not the type to make things up. Looking back, maybe I could have fought off whoever that was, especially since I was wearing full protective motorcycle gear. But in that moment, my instincts screamed at me to flee. That sound wasn't human, and I've avoided that road ever since. I have no intention of ever going back there again. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw that night. There aren't any mental institutions nearby, so I doubt it was an escapee. I still don't know who or what was out there in the dark, alone, dressed in white with no light, in the middle of nowhere.